What? A woman walked into the courtroom laughing, smiling, as if nothing had happened. No visible emotion, no hesitation, just a calm that didn't match what everyone else in that room already knew. Because just days earlier, Mickese Bostic had been focused on something completely different. He had been planning, not for himself, but for his family. Easter was coming up, and at the same time, a birthday celebration for one of his children. He took his time. Decorations, food, making sure everything looked right, creating a space where his kids could enjoy the day without worrying about anything else. That was important to him. He wanted it to feel special. And when that day finally came, it looked exactly how he imagined it would. But before the night was over, that same house became the center of something no one there expected. At some point during the evening, an argument broke out. Not just a disagreement, but something that escalated enough for Birmingham police to be called to the scene earlier that night. Officers arrived, assessed the situation, and at that moment, there was nothing they could act on. So they left. Because later that same night, everything changed. Calls started coming in again, this time, not for a disturbance, but for something far more serious. The kind of call that shifts everything instantly. Officers responding realized quickly, this wasn't routine. They had what's known as a max officer emergency. More than 25 units responded to a single address. What had been a family gathering just hours earlier was now a scene no one could ignore. And at the center of it all was the same man who had spent days planning that celebration. The same man who made sure everyone had a place to be that day. The same man who brought his family together. He never made it off that street alive, because what started as a perfect family gathering ended in a way no one there will ever forget. And what led up to that moment is even more unsettling. Before we get into this, if you're watching right now, take a second to subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? Mickese Bostic was the kind of man people depended on without having to say it out loud. At just 27 years old, he had already stepped into responsibilities that many people avoid for much longer. He wasn't chasing attention or trying to impress anyone. He was focused on something much quieter, building a life that his children could feel secure in. And everything about how he lived pointed to that. He worked for Jefferson County as a juvenile detention officer, a job that required patience, discipline, and a level of emotional control most people underestimate. Day after day, he was surrounded by young people who were already dealing with consequences, anger, and difficult situations. It wasn't an easy environment. It demanded consistency, the kind of consistency that shows who you are when things aren't simple. That same steadiness carried over into his home life. Because at home, Mickese wasn't just working a job, he was raising a family. He shared children with Mickese Jackson, but those who knew him made it clear that he didn't separate responsibilities. He didn't draw lines between mine and yours. He stepped fully into the role, treating all the children in that household as his own. And that matters, because stepping into a blended family isn't always easy. It requires patience, sacrifice, and a willingness to show up even when things aren't perfect. But for Mickese, that wasn't something he talked about. It was something he did. He provided. He stayed involved. He made sure his presence was felt in the small, everyday ways that often go unnoticed until they're gone. Family members described him as someone who worked hard, not just to get by, but to create something stable. Someone who understood that being a father wasn't just about being there physically, it was about being dependable. And that word kept coming up. Dependable. The kind of man you could call. The kind of man who would answer. The kind of man who didn't disappear when things became difficult. A person who created moments, like that Easter gathering, where everything felt okay. And that's the part that lingers. Because when someone like that is suddenly taken away, it doesn't just leave a gap, it leaves questions. Questions about how something so stable could change so quickly. And questions about the moments leading up to that night that no one fully understood at the time. On the surface, their relationship looked like something many people could relate to. Mickese Bostic and Mickese Jackson were raising children together, building a life that required constant effort, compromise, and adjustment. They shared responsibilities, shared space, and shared the kind of day-to-day pressures that come with trying to make things work for a family. And for a long time, that's exactly what it looked like. Two people doing their best to manage everything in front of them. They had children together, and Mickese had taken on the role of being present for all of them, not just the ones he was biologically connected to. Those who knew them didn't immediately describe their relationship as volatile or dangerous. It wasn't something that stood out as extreme. There were no obvious signs that something this serious would happen. But that doesn't mean everything was smooth. There were disagreements, arguments that at times became difficult enough to draw attention. Not constant, not explosive, but present enough to suggest that things weren't always settled between them. And that's where this story begins to shift. Because in many cases like this, the warning signs don't come in dramatic moments. From the outside, it's easy to assume that everything is manageable, that whatever tension exists is just part of normal life, that things will calm down on their own. But sometimes they don't. In Mickese and Shatice's case, there was no single event that clearly pointed to what would happen next. No one moment that stood out as the turning point. Just a series of interactions, emotions, and pressure that continued to exist beneath the surface. And that's what made it harder to recognize. Because nothing about it felt urgent enough to stop everything. Nothing about it made people think. This could turn into something irreversible. But relationships under pressure don't always break in obvious ways. Sometimes they hold together just long enough to appear stable until they don't. And in this case, that shift didn't happen over months. It happened in a matter of hours. Because on the day everything changed, the tension that had been building didn't stay contained. It came out, in front of family, in a space that was supposed to be safe. And once it started, there was no pulling it back. Easter Sunday began the way it was supposed to. Family members were arriving, moving in and out of the house, greeting each other, settling into the kind of atmosphere that only comes with gatherings like this. It wasn't just Easter. It was also a birthday celebration for one of the children, which made the day feel even more important. There was laughter, conversations overlapping, children running around, moving between rooms, stepping outside and back in again. The kind of energy that fills a home when people come together, not out of obligation, but because they want to be there. And at the center of it all was Mickese. He was hosting, making sure everything was in place, checking on people, moving between responsibilities without drawing attention to it. It was the role he naturally stepped into, the one that made sure everyone else could relax. Food was prepared. People were eating, talking, sharing moments that, at the time, felt ordinary. Safe. It looked like what anyone would describe as a good day. A perfect Easter. But like many situations that later turned tragic, the shift didn't come all at once. It started small. At some point during the gathering, tension began to rise between Mickese and Shatice. At first, it didn't stand out. Just another disagreement in the middle of a busy day. Voices slightly raised, a change in tone that some people may have noticed, while others continued with their conversations. Nothing about it, at that stage, suggested that things would go any further. But the argument didn't fully settle. It lingered. And as the day continued, so did that underlying tension. Family members were still present. Children were still moving around, unaware of the weight building between two people in the same space. And then, the situation escalated enough for someone to make a call. Police were contacted. Officers arrived at the scene, stepping into what, from the outside, still looked like a family gathering. They assessed the situation, spoke to those involved, and tried to understand what had happened. But in that moment, there was no clear sign of a crime, no immediate threat that required action, no reason, based on what they could see, to take anyone into custody. So they left. And that decision, based on what appeared to be a manageable situation, marked a turning point. Because whatever disagreement had taken place had reached its limit. The presence of law enforcement had been enough to calm things down. And for a brief moment, it did. The noise settled. People returned to their conversations. The gathering continued, but something had already changed. Because even though things appeared quieter, the emotion behind that argument hadn't disappeared. It was still there. Unresolved. And in situations like this, that matters. Because when conflict doesn't actually end, it doesn't just go away. It waits. And sometimes it comes back stronger. The tension between Mickese and Chase was still there, and not long after, she left. It wasn't a dramatic exit. No loud announcement. Just a decision to step away from the situation. For some people there, it may have felt like a good sign. That distance would give both of them time to cool off. That whatever had been building would finally come to an end. Because sometimes leaving feels like the resolution. Like the argument is over. Like things won't go any further. But in reality, leaving doesn't always mean letting go. Sometimes, it means carrying everything with you. And for Chase, whatever she was feeling in that moment didn't disappear when she walked away from that house. It followed her. The frustration, the anger, the pressure that had already surfaced earlier in the day. It didn't fade, it stayed active. And as time passed, it built. And then, she came back. Because when she walked back into that space, it was clear almost immediately that something was different. The energy had changed. This wasn't the same tone from earlier. The disagreement didn't restart quietly. It came back stronger, sharper, more intense than before. Voices were raised again. The argument picked up right where it had left off, but now there was more behind it. More emotion, less control. People nearby began to notice. Some may have tried to step in. Others may have stayed back, unsure of how far things would go. Because at that point, it still hadn't crossed into something irreversible. Not yet, but it was getting close. The back and forth continued, and in that moment, it stopped being just an argument. It became something heavier, more unpredictable. And then, it escalated again. Chase reached for a firearm. People reacted. Some stepped back, others froze. Because no one expects a moment like that to happen in the middle of a family gathering. The tension was no longer building. It had reached a point where anything could happen. And in the middle of that moment, the exchange between them became sharper, more direct. And what happened next? No one there was prepared for. Outside, the air felt different. The noise from inside the house faded into the background, replaced by something sharper. Voices raised, movement, people stepping closer but not too close. The argument had followed them out, and now it had space to grow. Mickese was there, still trying to manage the situation, still present in the same way he had been all day. But this wasn't about hosting anymore. This wasn't about keeping things together. This was something else. Chase moved toward the car. At first, it wasn't immediately clear what she was going to do. People watched, some confused, others cautious. Moments like that can go in different directions. Sometimes someone leaves, sometimes the situation breaks apart on its own. For a second, it looked like that might happen here. That she would just drive off. That the tension would finally end. But it didn't. She got into the driver's seat. The engine came on. People started reacting, calling out, trying to understand what was happening. Some stepped back, creating distance without fully realizing why. Because there was a split second where everything hung in place. Mickese was still there, still standing, still within reach. And then, the car moved. Not slowly, not in hesitation, it surged forward. The distance between them closed in an instant. There was no time to step aside. No time to process what was happening. He wasn't running. He didn't even have time to react. The impact came hard. His body was forced back, pinned between the vehicle and the house. The force of it changed everything in a single moment. Screams broke out immediately. People rushed forward, others froze where they stood, trying to make sense of what they had just seen. The shift was too sudden, too extreme. Children were there, close enough to hear everything, close enough to see the aftermath unfold in real time. Voices overlapped, someone yelling his name, others shouting for help, for someone to call emergency services. The scene became chaotic, but not in a way that felt organized. It was confusion, shock. Mickese was still pinned, unable to move. The same man who had spent that day making sure everyone else was okay, now surrounded by people who didn't know how to help him. Time didn't slow down. It moved in a way that felt disconnected. Seconds stretched, but nothing changed the reality of what had already happened. The car, the impact, the position he was in. All of it had already crossed a line that couldn't be reversed. Some tried to get closer, others pulled back, unsure of what to do next. The situation was no longer something anyone could control. And in the middle of it all, the weight of that moment settled in. Because this wasn't an accident in the way people expect. This wasn't something that just happened. It was the result of everything that had built up throughout the day, now unfolding in front of everyone at once. Sirens were called. Help was on the way. But the damage had already been done. And as people stood there, watching, shouting, hoping for something to change, nothing did. And by the time help arrived, it was already too late. The chaos didn't end when the car stopped. It shifted from noise to something heavier. People were still moving, still calling out, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. But beneath all of that, there was a realization starting to settle in. This wasn't something that could be undone. Emergency responders arrived, stepping into a scene that only minutes earlier had been a family gathering. What they found was a man critically injured, surrounded by people who were still in shock, still trying to hold on to the hope that somehow, this wasn't as bad as it looked. But it was. Despite the urgency, despite the effort to respond as quickly as possible, Mickese Bostic was pronounced dead at the scene. And just like that, everything changed. The same place that had been filled with celebration, laughter, and family moments was now marked by loss. The shift was immediate, and for those who were there, it wasn't something they could step away from or forget.
Happy birthday to us! Mom, you gotta do his birthday here too. Yeah, I'm in the mother.
Because this didn't happen somewhere distant. It happened right in front of them, and for some, especially the children, it may have been something they witnessed firsthand. That part is hard to process, because moments like that don't just end when the scene clears. They stay. They settle into memory in a way that doesn't fade easily. For Mickese's family, the reality of what had just happened came in waves. There was disbelief at first, questions, confusion. How did a day that started like that end like this? Family members spoke about him not as a victim, but as someone who showed up for the people in his life. Someone who worked, someone who stayed present, someone who carried responsibility without making it look like a burden. And now, all of that had been taken away in a matter of seconds. As officers secured the scene, Mickese Jackson was taken into custody. The situation had crossed from a domestic dispute into something far more serious. She was later charged with capital murder.
In a Birmingham homicide case, Mickese Jackson, a 30-year-old mother, is facing a capital murder charge after police say she ran over 27-year-old Mickese Bostic, the father of her children, during a gathering on Easter Sunday.
And today she made her first court appearance.
A charge that reflects not just the loss of life, but the circumstances surrounding it, including the presence of children during the incident. And that detail adds another layer to everything. The legal process would begin from there, moving into a system that focuses on charges, evidence, and outcomes. But for the family, none of that replaces what was lost. Because no matter what happens next in court, Mickese isn't coming back. And the space he filled in his children's lives and his family in that home remains empty. So now the questions shift from what happened to why. And that's where this story becomes even more important, because moments like this don't just come from nowhere. They build, they escalate, and sometimes they reach a point where there's no turning back. What do you think really happened in that moment? Let me know below. What makes this case difficult to process isn't just what happened at the end, it's how normal everything looked before it did. There were no obvious warning signs that would make someone step back and say, "This is about to turn deadly." There was no clear moment where everything crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Instead, it looked like something familiar. A relationship under pressure. Two people dealing with responsibilities, expectations, and emotions that don't always align. From the outside, it appeared manageable, like something that would pass, something that didn't require urgent attention. And that's where the danger begins. Because in many situations like this, the tension isn't loud at first. It builds quietly. In disagreements that don't fully resolve. In conversations that end without understanding. In moments where emotions are pushed down instead of worked through. And over time, that pressure doesn't disappear. it accumulates. The idea that everything is fine becomes a kind of cover, not because people are trying to hide something extreme, but because they want things to work. They want stability. They want to believe that whatever tension exists is temporary. But wanting something to work doesn't always make it safe. In Mickese and Shatice's case, nothing about their relationship seemed extreme enough to suggest an outcome like this. That's what makes it unsettling. Because it shows how easily serious situations can exist beneath the surface of something that appears stable. Another critical moment in this story is the act of leaving and then coming back. That sequence matters. When someone leaves during a heated situation, it often creates the impression that things are over. That distance will calm emotions, that space will allow everything to settle. But that's not always what happens. Sometimes, leaving doesn't reduce emotion, it intensifies it. It gives time for thoughts to replay, for frustration to grow, for anger to become more focused. And when that person returns, they don't come back neutral. They come back carrying everything that built up while they were gone. That return becomes a turning point, because now the situation isn't just continuing, it's escalating. And that's exactly what happened here. The earlier argument didn't end when she left, it paused. And when she came back, it came back stronger. That's something people often underestimate. They assume that time apart will fix things, when in reality it can sometimes make them worse. Then there's the introduction of a weapon. That moment changes everything instantly. When a firearm is brought into an argument, the situation is no longer contained. The level of risk increases immediately. Not gradually, not over time, but in that exact moment. Even if it isn't used, the presence alone shifts the entire dynamic. It creates fear. It removes the possibility of a simple resolution. And it pushes the situation into a space where outcomes become unpredictable and irreversible. In this case, the situation moved from words to a weapon, and then to something even more final. And that progression happened fast. Faster than anyone there could fully respond to. That's another key takeaway. Escalation doesn't always happen over days or weeks. Sometimes it happens in minutes. A disagreement becomes an argument becomes confrontation, a confrontation becomes action. And once that action crosses a certain point, there's no way to undo it. That's the part that stays with people. Because looking back, it's easy to see the sequence. But in the moment, it doesn't feel that clear. And that leads to the questions that matter most. How well do we really know the people closest to us? Not just who they are on good days, but how they respond under pressure. What signs do we ignore because we want things to work? The raised voices that get dismissed, the tension that gets explained away, the moments that feel uncomfortable but not serious enough to address. And how often do we assume that things will calm down on their own? Because in many cases they do. But in cases like this, they don't. This story isn't just about a single moment of violence. It's about everything that led up to it. The pressure that built quietly, the conflict that wasn't fully resolved, the decisions made in a short span of time that carried permanent consequences, and the reality that sometimes the most dangerous situations are the ones that don't look dangerous at all until it's too late. Just hours before everything changed, that same space felt completely different. There was movement, laughter, voices overlapping in a way that made the day feel full. Children were present, family gathered close, and Mickese was at the center of it, doing what he always did, making sure things were in place, making sure everyone else could enjoy the moment. It was Easter, a day meant for togetherness, and for him, it wasn't just about showing up. It was about creating something his children could remember. A moment where things felt normal, where everything felt steady. Nothing about that beginning hinted at how the day would end, because by the time night came, that same place held a completely different weight.
What?
The laughter was gone. The conversations had stopped. And the man who'd been moving through that space just hours earlier was no longer there. That contrast is what makes this story stay with you. How a day can begin with intention, with care, with effort, with love for the people around you, and still end in a way no one could have predicted. Mickese didn't wake up that day expecting conflict. He didn't plan for anything beyond being present for his family. Hosting, providing, doing what he had always done. But somewhere between those early moments and the final ones, everything shifted. And it happened fast. So fast that there was no time to adjust, no time to step away, no time to stop what was already in motion. His last moments weren't planned. They weren't controlled. They were the result of everything that had built up throughout the day. Everything that had gone unresolved until it reached a point where nothing could be taken back. And now, what remains isn't just the memory of how it ended, but the memory of who he was before it did. A father, a provider, someone his children depended on. And that's where the story continues, through them. Because while his life ended that night, their lives move forward without him. Without the presence they were used to. Without the consistency he brought into their world. And that absence becomes something they carry. In birthdays, in holidays, in moments that were once shared. He spent that day creating memories for his family, not knowing it would be the last they'd ever have with him. And that's what makes this story more than just a sequence of events. It's a reminder of how quickly things can change. How moments we assume are safe can shift in ways we don't expect. And how the people we rely on most can be taken in an instant. If this story moved you in any way, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts below. Your voice matters, and these conversations bring awareness to situations that often go unnoticed until it's too late. And if you're new here, consider subscribing to True Crime Stories Chronicles for more stories told with clarity, depth, and respect. Stay safe, and take care of the people around you.